Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
And welcome to Invest Africa. With the holiday season just behind us, most people would have been recently exposed to the hospitality industry. Now, it is an industry that is taking off locally as the African continent rises. The World Tourism Organization forecasts that there will be 85 million arrivals to the continent by the year 2020. Now, that's compared to a mere 6.7 million that came here in 1990. Now, the projection is overwhelmingly positive, but in a challenging economic environment, how does this industry remain resilient? Well, to answer that question for us, I'm joined in studio now to explore more is Gillian Saunders, Principal and Head of Advisory Services at Grant Thornton, Johannesburg. And from our Lagos studios is Trevor Ward, Head of Consultancy at Services Hotel Partner Africa. You can tweet us, meanwhile, at CNBC Africa with the hashtag Invest Africa. Well, maybe let's begin with you, Gillian, taking back a review as to the progress that has been made. If we look back from 1990 to where we are now, how have we fared and are we on the right track?
Well, I think it's like you said, it's Africa rising. So what's happening is the hospitality industry in Africa is growing with the continental growth. So as the economies on the continent have started to turn, as democracies have started to get more prevalent on the continent, you see people traveling here for business purposes. And largely on this continent, the hotel industry is driven by the business traveler. There are significant leisure travel destinations. Kenya, Tanzania is one area, but it's the business traveler that's sort of spurred the growth in the hospitality and hotel industry on the continent over the last decade. And that is really what everybody's saying is Africa growth, Africa middle class growth, the resources and the diversification of economies on the continent drives hotel demand.
It drives hotel demand. What about using tourism as a vehicle for economic growth as well as stimulating job creation? Is that something that we've capitalized on as Africans so far?
Well, my answer is yes and no. I think automatically it is driving growth and job creation. I think to really get that, you need to also stimulate your leisure tourism industry. And again, while Southern Africa and Eastern Africa have got reasonable leisure tourism industries, it's not big on the continent. Many countries are predominantly business travelers. And in order to really get that, we need more peace, more democracies, more development of that next phase of maturity in terms of people traveling. But the other big thing we've got to watch, and we know is going to happen, is the Africans themselves, the middle class Africans in particular, at the upper tier of that traveling on the continent for leisure purposes as well. And then yes, tourism can drive jobs. There's a couple of other enablers though that we need, and one of the things that restrains us is air connectivity too, and we really need to free up the air connectivity on the continent to allow the travel from outside to move within the continent and Africans to move in within the continent. And there's various projections of that tourism growth, air connectivity improvements that show phenomenal job creation on.
This air connectivity movement, maybe it's time to cross to Trevor to get his analysis on this. Are there particular ways in which we can cultivate investment then into not only tourism but the hospitality sector as well to boost this kind of activity that Gillian has alluded to?
Well, I certainly agree with the fact that tourism, perhaps more than any other industry, can create jobs, not just numbers of jobs, but also the quality of jobs and where those jobs are created. There are parts of some African countries where it's not going to be possible to develop a financial industry, for example, but tourism can go there. So tourism creates jobs which are geographically spread and also creates jobs for women and for unskilled workers, male and female. So there is huge potential for job creation. One thing I find a bit difficult is generalizing about Africa. Remember, it's 54 countries, and North Africa is very different from South Africa, which is very different from the vast majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I find it more constructive to talk about individual countries, or even individual cities, rather than Africa as a whole.
Maybe if we take a look at what's happening in those different demographics, then maybe if you can give us a comparison, North Africa versus South, East versus West. What are the particular nuances that are influencing and currently impacting on the tourism environment in those regions?
Well, if you take North Africa, which for me is the 5 countries from Morocco across to Egypt, 3 of those countries, Morocco, Tunisia and Egypt, have very, very highly developed tourism industry, partly because of their location close to Europe, with being a major demand source, but also, of course, because of the product that they have there, not just the beaches, but of course the antiquities in many of those countries. So North Africa really has a very well developed tourism industry, as I say, in 3 of the countries, Morocco, Tunisia and Egypt. And then you have South Africa at the other end, also a very developed economy, till recently the largest economy on the continent. And importantly, and this is the same for North Africa and South Africa, with lots of airlift. In other words, the ability to bring tourists in to the countries, not just leisure tourists, but business and conference visitors. So there are quite big differences between, if you like, the 3 Africas, the North, the South, and the big bit in the middle, sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, there are differences between some of the countries, with Nigeria being a major powerhouse in West Africa, and then the tourism countries of Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya in the east.
Thanks for that analysis there, Trevor. But I want to get your insights here, Gillian, because some of the regions that he mentioned do rely very heavily on the natural resources space. He mentions the beaches, some of the destinations that you want to visit. And some say that maybe there's a heavy reliance on the natural resources here. Do we need to look at diversifying the product offering when it comes to building up on the tourism sector and economies?
Well, if we're talking about leisure tourism, which is the element that relies on the beaches, Trevor did mention the antiquities in Northern Africa as well. And if you come to South Africa, we say in South Africa you've got a very generalist tourism experience. So you've got from an iconic city like Cape Town, through the safari option, through a lot of heritage and culture. Now, pretty much a lot of the rest of Africa, they've concentrated the leisure tourism on the beaches or the safari being the very big element. And I think what we're trying to do now, and what's driving, let's call it more nuanced niche growth in tourism, is to look at heritage and culture. So you get a country like Ethiopia, for instance, which has got phenomenal heritage to complement scenery, which is also very important. So scenery, beaches, wildlife safari, and then heritage and culture is important. And getting a more rounded and diversified leisure tourism product out there is going to help grow the leisure tourism to the continent.
Is there a particular focus that we should be having? Because earlier you alluded to the business traveller and changing them into leisure visitors. Do we need to build on both, or rely on the easier one, which is potentially leisure?
Actually, the business traveller is probably the one that's sort of there and it's easier. So that really does, if you look at the hotel industry on the continent, that drives most of the hotels. Even in South Africa, the hotel industry survives more on the business traveller than they do on the leisure traveller. The leisure traveller is very important, and our international level of leisure travellers are very important, but the backbone of the industry is the business traveller, and then linked to that is conferences and conventions and exhibitions and people who travel for that type of business tourism. So that's critical. And the real driver of the hotel industry on the continent is still the economic growth on the continent. And for instance, Kenya becoming a massive infrastructure development, Ethiopia getting into manufacturing, Mozambique into resources, and even countries, you know, like Angola, the oil. And maybe the oil price is one of those little dampeners, because there's always a few things, whether it's Ebola or oil price, or unfortunately terrorism is impacting on Kenya quite a lot at the moment in terms of their leisure tourism, not their business tourism, but their leisure tourism. So we've got to look at both. And if you're in the industry, you'd like to have a bit of your eggs in all the baskets. So if you can have a destination like Cape Town, you can have business travellers and leisure travellers in your hotel.
It's interesting you mentioned that, and I want to get us into the threats in a little bit later. But Trevor, you had some insights as well that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for the leisure traveller, Africa has a hugely diverse product. Generalizing about Africa, but one of the things that many sub-Saharan African countries lack is facilities. Gillian's absolutely right. I think the future of travel in Africa is business travel, not just from outside of Africa, but within Africa itself, cross-border, you know, from Kenya to Tanzania and from Nigeria to Niger, for example. But the facilities that we're lacking are the conference centres. If you look at South Africa, you know, Gillian can comment better on what they have and have not, but you know, the country has the conference facilities on a major scale in Johannesburg, Durban and Cape Town. It's difficult to point to any major conference facilities, for example, in West Africa, although that is changing. And then you're talking about the transportation, the airports, the lack of good airport facilities. So we have the diversity for leisure travel. We have the need for facilities for them as well as for business travel.
I want us to delve into that issue, Trevor, with regard to the opportunity for conference travels as well as the infrastructure that's needed there. Surely this does pose an opportunity for the private sector to bring in further investment into regions like Nigeria. Recently, we saw the Marriott and Protea Hotel meeting together and forming some kind of conglomerate. Are we seeing that demand picking up in Nigeria and as well as on the west of the continent, that increased interest from the private sector to develop the infrastructure to boost business tourism?
Yes, there is definitely increased interest in investment, but I stress interest because, and I don't want to sound too negative here, but to a large extent there's a lot of interest expressed, but it's not being realised. If you look at the World Bank's doing business analysis, all of the major countries in Africa where there is potential for major tourism investment, in each of them it has actually got more difficult to do business rather than easier to do business. The big exception to that is Rwanda, where we all know that they've had some remarkable changes and improvements there. But all the other countries, and the big countries I talk about are like Angola, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania. They have slipped down the ranking. So a lot of interest in doing business, in investing, but it's not getting any easier to do so.
Trevor, just before we go to an ad break, does the issue of making a business-friendly environment go back to government policies? Primarily, I mean, 95% yes, it goes back to government policies, and whether they have any actual real interest in enhancing the tourism environment and the investment climate, or whether they're too focused on the quick wins of which is very often oil and gas. Exactly. Well, it's time for us to take a quick break, but we'll get back into the issues with regard to government policies as well as the threats and opportunities that are posing the hospitality sector on the African continent. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Now tonight we're looking at Africa's hospitality industry and the investment opportunity it offers. In the meantime, you can get in touch with us. We like to hear from you, so tweet us on @CNBC Africa with the hashtag Invest Africa. Still with me are my two guests, Gillian Saunders, Principal and Head of Advisory Services at Grant Thornton, Johannesburg, and in Lagos we're joined by Trevor Ward, Head of Consultancy at Services Hotel Partners Africa. To pick up on the issue of government policy, Gillian, if that is where the issue is lacking, are we seeing more involvement maybe from the private sector trying to boost each other? In other words, property developers working with those in the hospitality industry, working hand in hand in camaraderie to build up the sector?
Sort of yes and no again. Trevor's absolutely right. It's government policy, and sometimes it's government's will is there, but just the capacity to put an enabling environment there that allows the developer to get the zoning, to get the environmental impacts, to the banking system to get the debt funding, the local sophistication of the partners that you have on the ground in Africa as well, which is not necessarily government policy. It's finding, let's call it mature co-investors who understand the industry. Is thwarting. So there's and Trevor knows better than me, he runs a pipeline of African hotel projects, and what happens is some of those projects sit in the pipeline forever. Some of the notorious ones we know about are still 8 years in the building phase. So there's a lot of things making it hard to put the product on the ground. So when you talk about the partnership with the private sector in other arenas, there is a beginning of a property industry partnership. But again, the property industry has probably been a little slower to go into Africa. And the model on hotels is very different from a shopping centre. From a shopping centre, you build a shopping centre, your anchor tenant comes in and pays you a rent. Once you've got your anchor tenant, the other tenants flock to be in it and they pay you a rent. So the owner doesn't have risk. The hotel companies prefer that you, the owner, retain the risk of the business and you pay them a fee to manage your hotel for you. So that difference in the risk profile means it's a lot harder to get the investment money and a lot harder to get the processes to develop hotels. But there are partnerships coming up. It's a big model in South Africa, but relatively unusual, of shopping centres and hotels going up together. And a lot of the property developers in Africa, in South Africa, who are interested in parts of the rest of Africa, and Trevor's so right, you can't just say Africa, the rest of Africa, but they're interested in moving in, are moving in to some extent with the retailers and the shopping centre developments.
So it is a model that can work, but does also come with its own risk.
It's happening a little bit.
Trevor, maybe if you can also share your insights. So Gillian alluded to some of the projects that you are aware of that unfortunately do reach some kind of level of backlogs. What's holding us back there? What do we need to change or move and overcome in order to see these projects flowing through?
Well, the list of challenges that developers face is quite a long list. I think there's a lot of education that's needed on both sides. One is to improve the knowledge of developers or sponsors of projects who enter the industry not knowing enough about how to get a hotel developed, and I mean, without the advert, that's to some extent where we come in. But there's also the need for education for government to actually actively promote developments themselves, recognizing the job creation that we were talking about earlier, and then educating the financial sector on how hotel and tourism facilities work in the development phase and when they're operational as well, so that they can gear their financial products to the industry itself. And many other, I mean, local authorities in terms of their planning regulations can often be a challenge. But again, let's not be too negative about it. There are many opportunities, and there are many successful developers taking advantage of those opportunities.
You alluding to quite a lot of the heavy players or the big players in the industry, the more larger established multinationals. But what about the smaller companies? Are we seeing some kind of a focus being directed at developing smaller businesses and smaller players within the hospitality industry to add on and assist as bolt-ons to this big industry play?
Well, I mean, in our experience throughout Africa, it's actually the smaller entrepreneur who tends to get things done, whether that's because of the focus that they have, their passion for the industry, whether it's because of just the simple size of the project, and I'm talking in hotel terms of maybe something of below 100 rooms. Those are the hotels that tend to get built and many operate very successfully. So there's a huge opportunity at the lower end of the scale. If you like, the doability factor is very, very high. It does seem to be that the larger the hotel, the longer the delays in getting it done and the more challenges that are faced. And this is the issue that the big hotel chains face, the Hiltons, the Starwoods, the Marriotts of this world, in actually getting hotels built, because they tend to be much larger hotels.
Gillian, I want to get into one of the threats that you alluded to earlier on in this discussion that are working against the hospitality sector. That's the threat of Ebola on the west part of the African continent, as well as the terror attacks on the east of the continent. Does this have a ripple effect onto what's happening in the south and in the north with regard to hospitality?
Unfortunately, yes, particularly the Ebola crisis, which has impacted on leisure travel to the entire continent, simply because what Trevor says, it's 54 countries and it's big, is a lot of people don't realize that. So particularly some markets are very sensitive, and if there's Ebola in Africa, then they're not going to travel to Africa. We seem to be getting past it. I think some countries have been phenomenal, their national tourism organisation, in helping disseminate the right story. So people in the industry here tell me Botswana did a great job, and the Botswana Tourism Authority did a great job of saying, hang on, we're not near Ebola. But in our industry here, there's a lot of criticism of our National Tourism Authority, South African Tourism, that they didn't actually do any messaging. They didn't have any tactical messaging to deal with the particular crisis. They carried on with their normal marketing campaigns and nothing changed. So that's the clever things you need to be able to do to keep putting the right information out. It's the same with Kenya to some extent. The threats were very towards the north and certain very sparse, wild coastal areas to the north mainly. And unfortunately, when they're in Nairobi, it's not really where the leisure tourists or even the international business tourists are going as a general rule. But it's getting that messaging out. I mean, in this country, we went through years and years of having problems where there was a safety and security issue, but as long as you get your messaging out and you can try and educate your tourists, you can still do business. But yes, we all lost out, and I'm sure Trevor can tell you about West Africa, where it was much worse in terms of the Ebola impact.
Exactly, and Trevor, maybe this is the opportunity to come to you. We do know that Nigeria has been declared Ebola free, but surely this must have had an impact on the bottom line.
Well, I think the Ebola crisis, tragic as it was, is an extraordinary story about a number of things. One is how the tourism industry can be so adversely affected by something completely outside its control. And I'm talking about Ebola crisis. It was in the majority of the tragedy, let's call it, was in 3 small West African countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia. Nigeria suffered. We had only, I'm sorry to say only, we had only 8 or 9 deaths. Ghana had no deaths, yet both countries, the hotel industry was very severely affected because there was no message going out, you know, we're clean, we're okay. And there was just no messages going out at all. But it also showed the most extraordinary lack of sense of geography in the travel trade and in consumers. You know, a couple of anecdotes. And Gillian maybe have more. The deluxe hotels in Cape Town, which is something like 7,000 kilometers away from where it actually occurred, the Ebola crisis occurred. They had cancellations in Cape Town. They had cancellations for safaris in Tanzania. A sports group which was booked to go to Nigeria did not go to Nigeria because of security problems. They transferred the sports group to Kampala, and they then left Kampala for somewhere in Southeast Asia, I forget where, because of the Ebola crisis, which never touched Uganda. You know, people were just looking at Africa and saying, gosh, it must be Ebola, it must be next door to where we're thinking of going, and people cancelled. So I think Gillian was making the point about there's just no message going out. There's no crisis management whatsoever.
What's interesting is that the common theme of education and message is something that keeps on coming up. Telling people that, number one, Africa is not one country, it's made up of 54 states. How about taking advantage of the different regions that we have then, Gillian? We have SADC, we have ECOWAS, we have the East African communities of countries. Are these regions working together in order to communicate a unified message? For example, if South Africa had worked with Botswana, and not only that, but working together to cultivate the hospitality industry in the region and not selfishly looking at individual countries and their progress.
Well, it's very interesting that you comment on that, because I think it's starting to happen. So if you look in East Africa, there's a Kenya-Tanzania axis of cooperation on some things. If you look in South Africa, I've actually just been with the Minister of Tourism where we're talking about the South African Tourism Mandate, which is restricted officially to promoting tourism to this country, where it's limiting, because if we don't sell ourselves, and sorry we're saying again as part of Africa, but as part of the tourism circuit in parts of Africa, we're better off as part of the whole as we by ourselves alone. And a buyer, so say a buyer who wants to package Africa, they tend to not just package one country. There are circuits in different parts of the continent, if you like, that are recognized circuits. And so multiple countries together is very strong in terms of promoting leisure tourism, absolutely. And some of the conference tourism as well. So yes, I think watch this space. South Africa will be collaborating more formally, we hope, but maybe not formally, but more openly with some of our neighbouring countries in terms of promoting tourism and messaging for tourism. But it's going to be slow. Visas is another one where we need the countries to work together. And we're just getting Zimbabwe and Zambia saying that they'll do one visa for Victoria Falls. That will be brilliant because you've got both sides of the falls. And then a person can go to Zambia and still go to Zimbabwe easily. And that we hope will move to a SADC-wide visa. So the unification of visas and the reduction in the amount of bureaucracy and paperwork a tourist needs to go through will help a lot.
So the conversation is taking place, but hopefully it will pick up a lot sooner.
Yeah.
Trevor, maybe if we can get your insights as to whether or not something like this is taking part on the west of the continent, but also are we seeing the necessary investment in the infrastructure to make it easy for people to get around there? And again, government policies, as Gillian alluded to.
There are some places where it is easy to get around. I mean, few people would say it's easy or cheap to travel between countries by air. But generally speaking, the linkages are getting much better. Although, as I say, the airfares are frighteningly high. As an example, I fly from Nigeria to Cameroon, and the airfare is in the order of $1,500. I get offers to fly from London to the States for less than half of that cost.
It's going to take a while, but certainly progress will be made in the end. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much to my guests, Gillian Saunders, Principal and Head of Advisory Services at Grant Thornton, Johannesburg, and Trevor Ward, Head of Consultancy at Services Hotel Partners, Africa. Please remember to get in touch with us and send us your comments. The details are on your screen. But from myself and the Invest Africa team for today, it's goodbye.